locations. Some are in the brain, some are in the neck, some are in the abdomen. And so the endocrine system can seem a little bit overwhelming at first, just because it's so much happening, so many different hormones, so many different locations, physical locations. So I really want to break it down that we're really looking at a big picture of how the hypothalamus and pituitary can affect all of these different hormones, and really the axis of how that happens and how that can be regulated by those feedback loops, okay? In other words, I don't want you to get overwhelmed by all of the different structures we're talking about. Let's talk about the pineal gland. So the pineal gland is found at the base of the brain, right? So here it is, just at the base of the thalamus. It is a glandular tissue, as we talked about. It's epithelial in its origin. It's going to secrete melatonin. Has anyone heard of melatonin? I feel like it's a pretty common hormone. Who has heard of melatonin? Yeah, so some folks are saying yes, they've heard of melatonin. I think melatonin is something we've all at least heard of. It's on some sleep commercials sometimes. There's even over-the-counter melatonin. Yeah, it helps you fall asleep, right? So it's one of the hormones that can be given, supplemented over the counter, that helps you to naturally fall asleep. So when it is secreted naturally in our body, it is involved in the circadian rhythm. It's involved in that sleep-wake cycle. It helps to tell us, go to bed when sunlight is down, or be up and alert and awake when the sun goes up. So melatonin is really important, not just for our daily sleep-wake cycle, what helps us to feel rested or feel awake, but it is also involved in some of the circadian rhythms that I mentioned earlier. So the things that tells us that, there are longer days in the wintertime, or there are shorter days in the wintertime or longer days in the summertime, and how we should adjust our personality, our behavior, our patterns according to those different times. So the seasonal processes and the seasonal events that take place, especially in mammals, if you look at birds, for example, their migratory processes are also involved, or thought to be involved by the release of serotonin. And so, melatonin. And so melatonin is our sleep-wake hormone, but also our circadian rhythm hormone, and it is released by the pineal gland here. All right. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this first packet here. I am going to, again, pause to see what questions we have, and then I think we can just get started on the second one. We have a couple minutes left. And just to talk a little bit more about that melatonin there, this is why when individuals get older, they tend to need less sleep, because the pineal gland actually naturally calcifies. So with age, the pineal gland tends to get more calcified, less of that natural glandular tissue. And so individuals that are older, beyond 50s, 60s, they do not secrete as much melatonin, and so they don't need as much sleep. This is why typically we see older individuals being, security guards, or I'm sure you've experienced this if you live with grandparents or stayed with grandparents. They're typically up at the crack of dawn, really, really early, whereas they may go to sleep really, really late, and this is kind of why, right? The natural calcification of the pineal means that they secrete less melatonin, and really they just need less sleep. Okay, let's move on to the second packet here, learning objective 4, which is to describe the synthesis and secretion of thyroid hormones, and then distinguish between direct and permissive actions of the thyroid hormones. And when we say thyroid hormones here, we're meaning T3 and T4. So we want to say that to distinguish them from the other thyroid-related hormones that we've mentioned, which come from the hypothalamus and from the pituitary. So let's look a little bit more closely at the thyroid gland itself. So the thyroid gland is this butterfly-shaped gland or bat-shaped gland. It is located at the level of the trachea, right? So here's the trachea. It's actually around the trachea. It's got two different lobes, left and right lobe, and each lobe has different poles, superior and inferior poles. It is releasing two hormones mainly, T4, which is also called thyroxine or tetraiodothyronine, and then T3, which is triiodothyronine. And both of these hormones together are important for regulating our metabolism, okay? And if we think about the function of thyroid hormone, we can also use some of the dysfunction to really explain the role that this hormone plays in our body and regulating our metabolism. So if you think about states like hyperthyroidism, these are individuals where they secrete too much thyroid hormone. Think about, I don't know if you've ever seen, I'm sure you've seen, if you've been in a clinical setting, patients that may have Graves' disease, they may have a goiter, which is an enlarged thyroid gland, they may have the apoptosis, which is the bulging of the eyes. Those are all some of the physical manifestations of having too much thyroid hormone. These individuals are often anxious, nervous. They typically have excess weight loss, excess sweating, and that can really tell us about the role of thyroid hormone. It helps to speed up our metabolism. It helps to make our cells use more energy, use more ATP. This is why these patients sweat more. They are more active, more jittery, more anxious. And so that tells us a little bit about the role of thyroid hormone. Calcitonin, on the other hand, also secreted from the thyroid gland, helps to regulate our blood calcium levels. So our bone and our blood are two ways that we can regulate the amount of calcium in our body. And so when there's too much calcium in the blood, it gets deposited in the bone. And when there's too little in the blood, it can get evacuated or sort of eroded and then replaced in the blood from the bone. So calcitonin is one of the hormones that helps to regulate that balance between the bone and the blood levels of calcium. Okay, let's look at the organization of the thyroid gland here. So the thyroid is arranged in what we call follicles, and follicles are really just clusters of tissue that are surrounded by follicular cells. Inside the cell is what we call colloid, and I'll talk about exactly what makes up that colloid in just a minute. But then the actual cells that are around the colloid are going to be the functional cells that are responsible for making the hormones that we're going to talk about, right? That T3 and T4. So the follicular cells are making the thyroid hormone. The thyroid hormones are going to be stored in an inactivated form inside the actual follicle itself. In the center here, that substance is called colloid is really the stored inactivated form of the thyroid hormone itself. This is called thyroglobulin. And so thyroglobulin will later become converted to the active form, which is that thyroid hormone. Now, the iodide, which is the ionized form of iodine, is very, very important for the conversion of this thyroid hormone. In other words, we need iodide in our diet in order to convert the inactive form of thyroid hormone, which is thyroglobulin, that's what's found in the colloid, to the activated form, which is the T3, T4, which is released into the blood. This is why it is so important to have adequate amounts of iodine in the diet, because of this particular conversion, which is reliant upon that iodine. Okay, which is why we have iodine supplemented in like our table salt, in certain fish, in certain other grains and so on that we eat, because it's so important in our diet, especially in the developing fetus, especially in that embryonic period. Pregnant women need to be getting enough of it because of what we're going to speak about here and how it helps with the production of thyroid hormone. All right. So if we look at the colloid, so this is what is the substance inside the follicle itself. This is called colloid. And that colloid is really the thyroglobulin, the inactivated form of thyroid hormone. So thyroglobulin is here. It needs to be taken up by the thyroid follicular cell, which is this cell here that's lining the colloid. It needs to be taken up as either T3 or T4. And T3 versus T4 is really just a difference in one residue. So T4 has two DIT residues, right? Diiodothyronine means it has two. And if we put two of those together, we get four. If we take MIT, which is a monoiodothyronine, and we add it to a diiodothyronine, we're going to get three. So T3, T4 is really just a difference of how many residues are on that molecule. So we can take that T3, T4 up, take it into the cell, all right, bound to thyroglobulin, and then it can be dumped out on the other side of the cell and enters into the blood, and then it can be circulated in our blood circulation and have its effect on the other cells that we'll discuss. Now, in order for that to happen, we need iodine, right? That I in MIT and the I in DIT are the iodine residues that have acquired to convert these into their active form and for them to be converted into T3, T4. The other thing that's required is TSH. So TSH is coming from the anterior pituitary. It is being released into the blood circulation. It's going to make its way down, bind onto a receptor that's on this follicular cell, and by a second messenger pathway, right? This is a G-coupled receptor. We've talked about examples of G-coupled receptor and a second messenger pathway system. By that response, it's going to cause the follicular cell to take up that T3, T4, and then it's going to be converted across the cell in a vesicle and then released into the blood on this surface. So two things are required for this thyroglobulin, which is in the colloid, to be converted into thyroid hormone in the blood. We need TSH from the anterior pituitary as that precursor, right, to start this signal transduction pathway. And we also need iodine in order to actually make T3, T4. Okay. I'm going to stop here and see what questions we have. We've said quite a bit on this slide alone. Just want to make sure I leave enough time for questions. All right. Now, the action of thyroid hormone, as I mentioned, is so important, especially in that fetal period. It is going to be responsible for altering the rate of transcription of mRNA, which is really speeding up the rate and the efficiency at which the fetus is developing. This is why if pregnant women have a deficiency in iodine, the fetus can develop what's called cretinism, which is where there's insufficient levels of thyroid hormone that are available during their fetal developmental period, and that can significantly develop physical features of that fetus, cognitive abilities of that fetus. There can be learning disabilities. There can be physical facial deformities that are seen as a part of cretinism. So thyroid hormone, because of its role in increasing our metabolism, in increasing the rate at which our cells can do what they need to do, which means things like transcription, making proteins, transcribing DNA, or making mRNA. If the rate of those things, those cellular processes, is slowed down, that can significantly hamper the efficiency with which the fetus can develop and the rate of development of that fetus altogether. Okay. So here are some of the things that thyroid hormone does. It's called the calorigenic effect, and calorigenic just means that we're burning calories, right? We're consuming calories. It's more active or accelerated processes. So it's going to increase the rate of the sodium-potassium pump, which means that we can fire faster action potentials, right? Speed up the rate with which we can recover after an action potential. In other words, that relative refractory period can be sped up because the sodium potassium pump is working faster. It can also increase the number and size of our mitochondria, which simply means more mitochondria, more ATP, right? More oxidative phosphorylation, more of that electron transport chain happening, faster rate of that happening as well, which means more ATP, more energy. It's also going to increase oxidative phosphorylation enzymes, which translates to more ATP. It's going to enhance glycogenolysis, proteolysis, and lipolysis, which are the breaking down of glycogen, the breaking down of proteins, the breaking down of fats to liberate those that energy. In other words, more sources for ATP. It's going to promote gluconeogenesis and ketone synthesis, and then it's also going to promote the synthesis of beta-adrenergic receptors, which we talked about are important for the sympathetic nervous system and the transmission of neurotransmitters at the neuroaffective junction, which helps to relay sympathetic signals. Okay, so all of this is to say thyroid hormone speeds things up. Things move faster, more energy is required, more energy is liberated, and things are just moving more efficiently with adequate levels of thyroid hormone.